Hello everyone, and welcome. Before we begin, here's a quick explanation. Adolf Hitler was the dictator of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. He started World War II, caused the deaths of millions, and led one of the darkest periods in human history. We are not telling this story to support him and not to criticize him either. This video is purely for educational purposes to help you learn from history, practice English, and understand what really happened in his final 24 hours. If you want to know his complete life story, you can watch his full biography on our channel. But today, we focus on the last day, the end of everything. Told like a movie, but based entirely on real history. Welcome to the final day of a man the world will never forget. This is not a political story. It is not about supporting or attacking anyone. It is about a single moment in time, the last 24 hours of Adolf Hitler. A man who once stood before millions, now stood alone in silence. A man who once commanded armies, now sat underground, waiting for the end. Today, we'll walk with you through those final hours. We'll enter the bunker. We'll feel the walls tremble as bombs explode above. We'll see fear in the eyes of those who followed him to the very end. And yes, this video is also perfect for English listening practice. We use real events, clear storytelling, and strong vocabulary so you can improve your English while witnessing one of the most intense moments in history. It's late at night. The world above is on fire, but below ground inside the cold concrete bunker beneath Berlin, time feels frozen. Adolf Hitler, aged 56, sits alone. He knows the war is lost. He knows the city above is being taken, street by street, by the Soviet army. He knows death is only hours away. And yet, at this moment, he makes a strange decision. He turns to his assistant and says quietly, "Prepare for a wedding tonight. I will marry Eva." Why now? Why, after 14 years of silence, did he choose the end of the world to finally marry her? Eva Braun had been with him since she was 17. She had lived in the shadows, never shown beside him in photos, never mentioned in his speeches. For 14 years, she waited patiently, faithfully, and quietly away from the public eye. Twice, she had tried to take her own life, not because he hurt her, but because she felt invisible. Still, she stayed. She believed in him, and in his final days, she refused to leave the bunker even when everyone else begged her to escape. That's when he realized, this woman had followed him not for power, not for money, but out of blind, private loyalty. And now, with the city collapsing and the walls trembling, he said, "She deserves my name, even if only for a few more hours." It was not a romantic decision. It was not about love. It was about control, ritual, and finality. He wanted to leave nothing unfinished: a marriage, a will, a last speech, a planned ending. It was the beginning of his goodbye. In a small room, dimly lit and silent, the wedding began. There were no flowers, no music, only the sound of pens scratching on paper and distant explosions above. Eva Braun wore a pale blue silk dress. Her face was calm, too calm. Everyone around her said the same thing. She smiled, like she already knew how it would all end. She had accepted everything. Hitler wore a simple black suit, no medals, no uniform, no symbols of war. A civil officer stood before them and asked the traditional question, "Do you take this woman?" He answered quietly, "Yes." And just like that, after 14 long years, they were married. The staff tried to celebrate. A small table was set, a bottle of champagne was opened. But no one drank. No one laughed. The air was too heavy. One officer later said, "It felt like a funeral, not a wedding." After the ceremony, Hitler walked to a nearby room and sat at his desk. With a shaking hand and lifeless eyes, he began to dictate his final words. His political testament. His secretary, Traudl Jung, sat across from him, typing every sentence he spoke. He didn't apologize. He didn't cry. He didn't admit defeat. Instead, he blamed the Jewish people for the war. He accused his own generals of betrayal. He claimed that history would understand him, though he knew he would not live to see it. Then, he said something chillingly clear. I do not want my body to be captured. I want it to be burned. He remembered what had happened to Mussolini, whose body was desecrated in public. He would not allow the same fate for himself. He signed the document slowly, carefully, his last command. It was close to 5 a.m. After finishing, he went to rest, not to sleep, because no one truly slept that night, but simply to lie down and wait. Outside, Berlin was breaking. Soviet tanks crushed the last Nazi defenses. Buildings collapsed into fire and ash. German citizens above were running, crying, dying. But inside the bunker, time had stopped. The walls were thick, the air was still. A world trapped in glass, frozen, yet trembling with every explosion above. Eva sat beside him, holding his hand. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. They both knew this was their honeymoon and their funeral. Hitler's valet brought a small breakfast, dry bread, a little honey, and a cup of tea. He barely touched it. He looked thinner than ever, his face had aged 20 years in a single month. His right hand trembled, his eyes were dull, and his voice when he spoke was soft, almost a whisper. He didn't talk about war, or escape, or hope. He simply sat in silence, Eva beside him, as bombs shook the earth around them. Then a message arrived. Heinrich Himmler, the man who had stood by him for years, had secretly tried to negotiate peace with the Allies without Hitler's permission. Hitler stared at the report for a long moment. Then he erupted. He shouted, slammed the table, his voice echoing through the bunker. Traitor! Betrayer! I should have known. He ordered Himmler's arrest, though deep down, he knew there was no one left to obey. The system he had built was collapsing from within. And for the first time, even Hitler looked defeated. His eyes went quiet. He leaned back in his chair. He knew the end had truly begun. By noon, the air in the bunker had grown heavier. There was no fresh oxygen, no sunlight, only stale air and fear. Hitler walked slowly into the map room, the same room where, once, he had stood proudly beside his generals. He used to point at countries on the map, commanding armies, deciding the fate of millions. Now, those maps meant nothing. The lines were meaningless. The empire was broken. The war was lost. He looked down at the maps, not to plan, but to remember. These were once the maps of victory. Now, they were only a graveyard of dreams. He didn't speak much. His body trembled, his legs were weak. His personal doctor offered him medicine, but he refused. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't a war room anymore. It was a museum of his failure. Among the few things Hitler still trusted was Blondie, his German shepherd. She had been with him for years, sleeping beside him, walking beside him. Loyal, quiet, and calm. But now, he called his doctor, Werner Hasse, and said something chilling. Bring the cyanide capsules. I want to test them on Blondie. Why? Because Hitler no longer trusted anyone, not even the poison made by his own people. He feared someone might have given him fake capsules, letting him suffer instead of die. So, the doctor placed one capsule into Blondie's mouth. Within seconds, the dog was gone. No sound. No struggle. Just silence. For a long moment, Hitler said nothing. Then he looked away. That was his confirmation the poison worked. And now, he knew he could use it too. But for many in the bunker, that was the breaking point. When Hitler killed the only creature he had ever truly trusted, they understood he wasn't planning to escape. He wasn't planning to live. He was preparing to die. It didn't stop there. Eva's two small Scottish terriers, Wolf and Stassi, were next. Even Blondie's puppies, just a few weeks old, were poisoned silently by Hitler's dog handler. Why? Because Hitler didn't want to leave anything behind. No body, no bloodline, no animal, no memory. The bunker was becoming a place of total erasure. If I'm going, he thought, then everything I touched, everything I loved must vanish too. That afternoon, he gathered his remaining officers. Men who had served him for years, now standing before a man who looked hollow and half dead. Some pleaded with him one last time. Mein Führer, we can still escape. There's a plane we can hide you in disguise. You can go south. He shook his head slowly. No, I will not run. I will not be captured. I will stay here, and I will die here, in Berlin. Some were shocked. Some were terrified. And some quietly were relieved. Because now, they knew they could leave without guilt. He gave permission for others to escape through the sewers. Many would try that night. Most would never make it. But Hitler was done moving, done speaking, done fighting. Back in his room, he sat beside Eva Braun. She had changed into a simple dark blue dress. No makeup. No jewelry. She hadn't cried. She hadn't shown fear. She was ready. Hitler looked at her and said softly, "You still have time. You can leave. Go with them, escape." She smiled faintly and replied, "No, I stay with you." It wasn't love. It wasn't passion. It was loyalty, cold, blind, final. They sat in silence. No music. No words. Only the distant echoes of Berlin collapsing above them. Before the night ended, Hitler called his secretaries, his aides, his inner circle. One by one, they entered the room. He shook their hands, no speeches, no emotion, just a quiet farewell. "Thank you," he said. "You may go now." And with that, everyone knew the end was only hours away. He looked like a ghost, one secretary later recalled, yet somehow still polite. Some wept, others held his hand longer than they should have. But Hitler kept his face blank, emotionless, calm as if he were already gone. That moment closed a chapter. The people who once surrounded him like a king were now walking away, leaving him alone with his wife and his death. Strangely, the night grew quiet. Hitler ate a small meal, bread and tea, the same as before. He sat with Eva, they spoke very little. Outside, the bombs grew louder. The Soviets were only blocks away, gunfire echoed above the garden. Inside the bunker, however, Hitler did not move. He wrote in a small notebook, not orders, not news, because his war, his empire, was already over. He rose slowly, his legs were weak, his walk deliberate. He went to his private bedroom, and Eva followed. The door closed behind them. Guards stood posted, but no one was allowed in. It was not a night for sleep, it was a night to prepare. By sunrise, everything would end. As April 30th began, time lost its meaning. Above ground, Berlin was collapsing block by block. Explosions, gunfire, shells, human screams, the sounds were constant. Inside, the bunker felt like a still room, a waiting place for death. Hitler lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He did not sleep. Eva Braun lay beside him, quiet and strangely peaceful, already emotionally gone. She knew it was her final night. Down the hallway, staff members whispered softly, no one knew what to say. Slowly, Hitler got up. His steps were careful, his back was bent, his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. He walked the corridor, scanning the faces of the few who remained loyal. No anger. No panic. Only stillness, the calm of a man who had already said goodbye. They shared a small breakfast in the dining room, dry bread and tea. Eva tried to smile, Hitler tried to stay composed. Everyone understood this was not a meal but a ritual, the last small act before an irreversible end. Hitler called in his aide, Otto, and gave him two specific orders. First, after he and Eva were dead, their bodies must be carried outside and burned immediately. Second, the burning must be complete. No trace was to remain. He reminded Otto of Mussolini's fate, hung and mocked by the public, and said, firmly, that must not happen to me. You must burn us, no matter what it takes. Otto nodded, his face was pale and his hands trembled, but he agreed disobedience was not an option. Now dressed not in a uniform but in a plain military jacket and dark trousers, Hitler prepared himself. Eva put on a simple dark blue silk dress, her favorite, with no jewelry, only a faint perfume. She brushed her hair carefully, like a bride preparing for her last hour. Hitler walked the hallway, meeting his personal staff one by one. He shook hands slowly and quietly. To some he spoke a word, to others, just a nod. Thank you, he told his secretary Traudl. You may go now. You have served me well. Some started crying, others froze, unsure how to say goodbye. One officer later remembered, he looked like a shadow, not a man, the calm of someone who had given up. The goodbyes continued, one after another. No ceremony, no speeches, no tears from him, only silence. Hitler and Eva returned to their private room. Eva sat on the sofa, calm and unafraid. She opened a small brass capsule cyanide. She held it in her hand and looked at him. They had discussed this many times, they would not let the Soviets capture them. They would die together, on their own terms. Hitler held the same kind of capsule, yet he also prepared his Walther pistol, the one he had used for years. He planned to use both pill and bullet, just to be sure. He called in Otto Gunsche and his valet, Heinz Ling. Wait outside, he told them. When it is over, open the door. And with that, the final hours drew inexorably closer. Otto and Heinz nodded. They walked into the hallway and stood in silence, just a few feet from the door. Inside, Hitler and Eva sat together on the sofa. Around 3:30 p.m., the final act began. No one outside the door saw exactly what happened, but the witnesses heard a single, terrible sound, one gunshot. Otto Gunsche and Heinz Ling rushed in. What they found would become one of the most talked about scenes of modern history. Hitler was slumped on the sofa, his body still. A small hole marked his right temple. Blood had spattered the floor and wall. Eva lay beside him, there were no visible wounds, only the faint smell of bitter almonds, the odor of cyanide. Both were dead. The man who had once commanded millions was now a lifeless figure in a quiet, underground room. As ordered, Otto and Heinz began the grim task. They wrapped both bodies in thick gray blankets, carried them up the narrow staircase, through the tight hallway, and out into the garden behind the chancellery. It was still daylight. The ground shook with artillery fire, the Soviets were only blocks away. They placed the bodies in a shallow crater near the bunker exit, then poured can after can of gasoline over them. Otto struck a match, dropped it, and the flames rose. The bodies began to burn. There was no music, no prayer, no soldiers, no flag, only fire, smoke, and silence. They saluted the flames, then ran back into the bunker as gunfire cracked overhead. Inside, the remaining staff gathered. Otto reported, quietly, "The Führer is dead, his body has been burned." There was no celebration, no ceremony, only stunned faces, pale skin, empty eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone said, simply, "It's over." And just like that, everything Hitler had built, everything he had controlled, everything he had dreamed of was ash in a garden. Outside, black smoke rose as the flames consumed the wrappings. At first, the fire burned strongly. Then it began to weaken. The ground was damp from earlier rain and the supply of gasoline was limited. They doused and relit the pyre, but the bodies would not burn completely. Inside the bunker, people waited in stunned silence. No one planned the future. No one made lists. They sat frozen, knowing the Soviets could be at the door at any moment. Before his death, Hitler had signed a final political testament. In it he named Admiral Karl Dönitz as head of state, not Himmler, not Goebbels. When Dönitz, in northern Germany, received the message, he was shocked and confused. Germany was falling, the capital was lost, and yet he was now nominally head of a dead empire. Dönitz immediately began trying to negotiate with the Western Allies, hoping to surrender to the West rather than to the Soviets. Back in the Führer bunker, reality hit hard. The man who had controlled everything was gone, there were no orders, no leadership, no future for those who remained. Secretaries, cooks, aides, and soldiers realized they were no longer part of a government, they were part of a grave. Some began to prepare to leave. They packed small bags, grabbed warm coats, water, and maps. They knew the Soviets were closing in, they knew capture probably meant torture or death. But now, without Hitler, there was no clear path to safety. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, became the most senior official in the bunker. He was not surprised he had been there when Hitler said goodbye, but he had no intention of running or surrendering. Goebbels called his wife, Magda, and together they made a terrible decision: they would die in the bunker, and they would kill their 6 children with them. The decision shocked even the remaining staff, no one dared to argue. While Goebbels prepared for death, others prepared for escape. A group of about 20 guards, officers, and staff planned routes out of Berlin using secret tunnels, slipping out disguised as civilians, or attempting to cross the city under darkness and gunfire. The first group left just before sunset. They wore civilian clothes and carried light packs. Above ground, chaos ruled. Soviet tanks rolled in, gunfights erupted on every corner, fires lit the sky. Only a few escaped, most were killed or captured within hours. Otto and Heinz returned to the garden to check the remains of Hitler and Eva. What they found was disturbing: the bodies were partly burned, some flesh and clothing were blackened, but faces and features were still visible. They poured more fuel and burned them again, trying to reduce the remains to as little as possible. It wasn't enough. The remains were still visible, half burned, half intact. So, the men gathered what was left and buried it in a shallow crater not far from the bunker exit. They covered it with dirt, broken wood, and debris from the bombings. No cross. No marker. They wanted the bodies to disappear forever. Back underground, Magda Goebbels prepared for her own dark decision. She gave each of her 6 children sleeping pills, all between the ages of 4 and 12. Dressed in clean white clothes, they drifted into deep sleep. Then, with the help of an SS doctor, she gave them cyanide capsules. The children died silently, never waking up. Afterward, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked to the garden, the same place where Hitler and Eva had died just a day earlier. They sat together one last time. Joseph shot himself in the head. Magda took poison. Their bodies, too, were burned, though not completely. By now, the bunker had become a mass graveyard, a tomb of ashes, silence, and despair. The senior Nazi leaders were dead. Outside, the streets of Berlin burned. The Soviet army was closing in. The sky was filled with fire, gunshots, and chaos. No help was coming. Some cried. Some prayed. Others sat quietly, staring at the cold concrete walls, knowing the end had already arrived. This was no longer a war. It was the end of everything. The bunker grew darker than ever. The man it was built to protect was gone. His wife, his generals, his dogs, all gone. Above ground, the war raged on. Soviet soldiers fought their way through Berlin, street by street. Bullets, grenades, and fire filled the air. Inside, only a few survivors remained, hungry, trapped, and terrified. They didn't know whether they would be captured or killed. That night, a voice came over the German radio. Admiral Karl Dönitz, speaking from northern Germany, announced that Adolf Hitler had died. But he didn't say how. The Führer has fallen in battle, fighting for Germany, he claimed. It wasn't true and the world knew it. The Nazi regime wanted to protect Hitler's image, even after death. But the truth was about to surface. Soviet troops stormed the Reich Chancellery, capturing or killing the last defenders. Then they entered the Führer bunker. Inside, they found chaos, smoke, broken furniture, burned papers, maps on the walls, blood on the floor. Poison capsules, empty beds, and silence. But one thing was missing, Hitler's body. The Soviets searched every corner. They questioned survivors, explored tunnels, and combed through the garden. Finally, they discovered a shallow crater near the bunker entrance. Inside lay two burned bodies, one male, one female. The man had a gunshot wound in his skull. The woman showed no visible wounds. Scattered around them were bits of clothing, boots, and a dental bridge. The Soviets suspected it was Hitler and Eva Braun, but the bodies were so damaged they couldn't be sure. They collected the remains in secret, took photographs, and began quiet autopsies. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin received the news. He saw the reports, but instead of telling the world, he ordered silence. Why? Because silence was power. If we don't confirm his death, Stalin thought, the world will remain uncertain. And so, the greatest mystery of the 20th century began. Rumors spread quickly. Maybe Hitler didn't die. Maybe he escaped to Argentina. Maybe it was a double. Maybe he was still alive, waiting to return. When truth is hidden, fiction grows. It took decades to confirm the facts. Soviet doctors had performed autopsies. They compared dental records, the most reliable identification of the time. Years later, Hitler's dental assistant, who survived the war, confirmed the match. The burned jawbone with the gold bridge was indeed Hitler's. The Soviets hid this evidence for over 20 years. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, did they finally admit. The body found in Berlin was Adolf Hitler. With Hitler gone, Goebbels dead, and Berlin in ruins, nothing remained. On May 7, Germany signed its unconditional surrender to the Allies. On May 9, it surrendered to the Soviet Union. The war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany was finished. The Third Reich, once powerful, feared, and brutal, ended in a bunker, surrounded by silence and flames. Some people celebrated in the streets. Some cried in private. And some refused to believe it at all. Because how could a man who caused so much horror, end his life quietly, in a small room, with a pill and a gun? It felt empty. It felt too easy. But that was the truth. He didn't die in battle. He didn't face justice. He didn't beg for mercy. He died by his own hand underground, surrounded by fear, failure, and fire. The Soviets later destroyed the bunker. They blew up the entrance, covered it with concrete, and tried to erase it from history. For decades, the location remained a secret. Today, that spot is nothing more than a simple parking lot in Berlin. No signs. No statues. No memorials. Because Germany chose never to glorify the place where evil ended, and that choice is powerful. This was the true story of the last 24 hours of Adolf Hitler. Told not to praise. Not to support. Not to hate. But to learn, to understand, and to remember. What does this story teach us? No matter how powerful someone becomes, if they rule through fear and hate, they will always fall. In silence and in shame. History isn't just about facts. It's about understanding the cost of blind leadership, of war, of destruction. The most dangerous leaders are not always the loudest. They're the ones followed without question. And finally, If we do not learn from the past, we risk repeating it. This video also helps you practice real-life English through deep storytelling, emotional vocabulary, and simple sentence structure. So if you're learning English, you're not just watching history, you're improving your understanding, your listening, and your voice. If you found this story powerful, if you learned something today, and if you want more true, emotional, and educational stories like this, then please subscribe to this channel right now. Every video here is created with purpose to help you learn, grow, and become stronger in English and in life. Thank you for watching. See you in the next powerful story.